Good morning, student. Today we shall take up another interesting theory called as the law of diminishing marginal utility. Let us have an introduction towards this law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility was first propounded by the German economist by name Professor Gossen, which explains the behavior of consumer as well as basic tendency of human nature. This law was further modified and popularized by another eminent economist by name Professor Alfred Marshall. Then what does this law states? We shall understand. The law states that the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase in the stock of a thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. To put it in a simple word, we can say that as a consumer consumes more and more unit of a specific commodity, the additional utility derived or the utility derived from the next unit will diminishes or will go on diminishing. This is what we have to understand about the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law is based on certain assumptions which we are going to understand for now. The first assumption that we need to look into is various units of good are homogeneous. Here, the law of diminishing marginal utility is formulated based on this assumption that the various units of the good that is considered for the consumption are homogeneous. That means identical. The goods that are considered in our study is taken as identical. Homogeneous is nothing but similar or identical. They must be same in shape, size, quantity and so on. Therefore, the various units of goods must be homogeneous is the first assumption. The second assumption is there is no time gap between consumption of the different units. Here, when the consumption of different units are considered or taken into account, there is no time gap that is being given. All the units are consumed without giving any time gap continuously. So, there is continuous consumption of different unit. Like if a good is being consumed, it is consumed continuously one after the other. It's not like today we are having one good, tomorrow we are having another and day after one more. Therefore, there is no time gap that is being given, which is considered as the second assumption. The third assumption is taste, preference and fashion remains unchanged. Even the taste and preferences as well as the fashion that the consumer has will remain constant, will not change. And the last one is no price change. Price remains constant. As you know very well, the prices of goods and services changes from one time to another, but here assumption is being made that there is no price change. Price remains constant. So, these are the four important assumptions based on which the law of diminishing marginal utility is formulated. Let us understand what the law of diminishing marginal utility states. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that the additional benefit, here the term benefit is utility or you can also call it as satisfaction. The additional benefit that is utility or satisfaction which a person derives, which a person gets from a given increase in the stock of a thing diminishes with every increase in the stock that he already has. The actual meaning of this particular law can be taken as a consumer consumes more and more units of a particular commodity or a specific commodity, the additional utility derived from each unit diminishes. This can be explained with the help of a example. Let us take an example. Let us say that you are a consumer and you want to have ice creams. All are fond of ice cream. So let us take this example of having ice creams. You are about to have about 4 units of ice cream, and when you have the first unit of ice cream, you get the maximum level of satisfaction. That means when you have the first ice cream, it gives the maximum utility. Now you continue to have the second ice cream without giving the time gap. Continuously you are having it. It is one of the assumptions that is been made that each and every units have been consumed continuously without giving time gap. Now you are consuming the second ice cream. Here the satisfaction level that is being derived from the consumption of second ice cream will be lesser. Obviously it is lesser because initially when you started having the first ice cream, you had the desire of having ice cream. You did not eat any of the ice cream till then. You had the first ice cream, you had a desire of eating ice cream, and that desire is satisfied when you consume the first ice cream. Now when you eat the second ice cream continuously, the utility derived from the second unit is obviously lesser when compared to the utility derived from the first ice cream. And now you feel like I am satisfied. Then you are about to have another unit of ice cream. When you go for the third ice cream, the utility that you derive from the consumption of third ice cream further diminishes, it decreases. Now your want for having ice cream gets over and you don't want to have any more units of ice cream. But still when you continue to have further more ice cream, your utility level further declines. This is the idea of diminishing marginal utility, which states that as a consumer consumes more and more units of a commodity, the additional utility derived from each commodity diminishes, will go on diminishing. This is the idea that we need to have in the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law can be very well understood with the help of a schedule, which we are going to take now. In this particular table, we have the schedules of total utility, marginal utility, and the number of units of the commodity consumed by a consumer. We are already clear about what is total utility and what is marginal utility. To consider, total utility is the sum of marginal utility. When we take the total satisfaction derived from all the units of the commodity consumed by a consumer, we call it as total utility. Just by taking the summation of all the marginal utility, we get total utility. Then what is marginal utility? The additional utility derived from the consumption of an additional unit of the commodity is called as marginal utility. This schedule can be used to have an understanding of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Let us consider that a consumer consumes about 7 units of a commodity. Then what would be the total utility and marginal utility he derives, and we shall also understand a diagram and a diagrammatic representation of this schedule. When a consumer consumes the first unit of the commodity, the marginal utility that he derives is 20. Therefore, the total utility is also 20. Now let us consider marginal utility. When he consumes the second unit of the commodity, he derives some level of satisfaction which is lesser. When he consumes the second unit of the commodity, the utility level, the level of satisfaction declines. You can see here it is been declined from 20 to 15. It indicates that as consumer consumes more and more units, the utility derived from the successive unit, next unit will definitely diminishes, declines. Let us also consider what happens when he goes with the consumption of third unit. When he consumes the third unit of the commodity, the utility further declines to 10, which has been declined from 15 to 10. Likewise, when the consumer goes on consuming the fourth unit, then the utility derived from the fourth unit of consumption is just 5. Again, when he continuously goes for another unit of consumption, that is when he consumes fifth unit, he gets no satisfaction, that is satisfaction level will be 0. When the consumption of a commodity is done continuously without any time gap, the utility not only diminishes, it becomes 0. The satisfaction level he gets will be 0. He do not derive any level of satisfaction. When the consumer is done with consuming a commodity, when he is done with the consumption of the commodity, he do not want to have further more units to consume. By then the satisfaction level will be 0. Further, if he continues to have the 6th and 7th unit, then the utility gets into negative. It takes a negative value. That is what we can see here. Even though if the continuous consumption is made, when the consumption is done, then the utility derived from the 6th and 7th unit, you can see it takes a negative value of -5 and -10 respectively. Let us take another example to understand it clearly. Let us consider that you feel very thirsty at one point of time and you want to have a glass of water. When you drink the first glass of water, you feel happy and you get maximum level of satisfaction, that is utility. When you go for another glass of water, the utility that you derive from the consumption of the second glass of water will be obviously less. When you go for the third glass of water, the utility derived from the third glass of water further declines and you feel like your stomach is filled and you don't want to have any more glasses of water, but still when you continue to have another glass of water, that is fourth glass of water, you feel restless and you feel your happiness will turn into unhappiness and the utility derived from the consumption of that particular good, here in our example the consumption of water, the utility gets declined. This is what the law of diminishing marginal utility, that is as a consumer consumes more and more unit of a specific commodity, the utility derived from each unit of the commodity will decline. It goes on diminishing. Now let us take up total utility. Total utility is taken as all the marginal utility combined together, or the sum of all the marginal utility gives us total utility. As you have seen in this schedule, when the consumer consumes the first unit of the commodity, the utility derived, that is the marginal utility derived, is 20 and the total utility is also 20. And at the second unit, the utility derived, that is the marginal utility derived, is 15. Therefore, by adding the utility derived from the first unit and second unit, that is by adding 20 plus 15, we get the total utility, that is 35. At the consumption level of second unit. When the consumer consumes the third unit, at the third unit, the utility derived, the total utility derived is 45, which is an addition of the utility derived from the first unit of consumption, the second unit of consumption and third unit of consumption. By adding 20 plus 15 plus 10, we derive the total utility of 45. When the consumer consumes the fourth unit, the utility derived is 50. When the consumer consumes the fifth unit, the total utility remains 50. Why? Because here the marginal utility is 0. By adding 50 and 0, you get 50. Then when the consumer consumes the sixth unit, the total utility falls to 45. Why there is a decrease in total utility? Because the marginal utility takes a negative value. When the marginal utility takes a negative value, total utility diminishes, it decreases. Further, the same thing happens in the seventh unit. Since the marginal utility takes a negative number, the total utility further diminishes to 35. In this particular diagram, commodity consumed, which is measured in units, is measured along x-axis. Total utility and marginal utility is measured along y-axis. We have two curves here. One is marginal utility curve, the other one is total utility curve. Let us first understand how to derive the marginal utility. Since we have already taken the schedule for consideration, there you have noticed that when a consumer consumes the first unit, the marginal utility that he derives is 20. Therefore, you need to plot a point parallel to 1 and 20. When the consumer consumes the second unit, the utility derived is 15. Therefore, you need to mark a point parallel to 2 and 15. When the consumer consumes the third unit, he derives the satisfaction of 10, and when the consumer consumes the fourth unit, the utility derived is 5. When the consumer consumes the fifth unit, he derives no satisfaction, therefore it is 0. When the consumer consumes the sixth unit, the marginal utility takes a negative value, that is minus 5. When the consumer consumes the seventh unit, again the marginal utility gets into a negative value, that is minus 10. You can see that after the satisfaction level is 0, after the point 0, here you can see that the marginal utility cuts x-axis and it takes a negative slope. You can see the marginal utility curve constantly falling with every additional commodity consumed. Here you can see mu curve is constantly falling with every additional utility and units of commodity consumed by a consumer. Let us join all these points, we get a marginal utility curve. Likewise, we can also derive total utility curve. As per the schedule and the data, we must plot the points. When you plot the points, that is when the consumer consumes the first unit, the total utility derived is 20. When the consumer consumes the second unit, the sum of marginal utility 20 plus 15 gives you 35. Therefore, the total utility derived from the consumption of second unit is 35. Likewise, you need to plot the points as per the data that is been taken in the schedule, and when you join all the points, we get the total utility curve, which explains that when you keenly observe this diagram, when you have a closer look at this particular diagram, you can notice that the marginal utility curve is downward sloping. It is constantly falling with every additional unit of commodity consumed, and the total utility will be rising. In the beginning, initially it will be rising. At a certain level, it takes a downward slope. When the marginal utility takes a negative value, the total utility diminishes. Obviously, the total utility starts rising in the beginning and at a certain level it stops and takes a downward slope, or the total utility falls when the marginal utility takes a negative value. We shall understand the relation between total utility and marginal utility. Here, total utility rises when marginal utility diminishes. When you see the diagram, you notice that the marginal utility was sloping downward, it was diminishing, and the total utility was rising, that is, it rises. Total utility is maximum when marginal utility is 0. When marginal utility reaches 0, that is, when the consumer consumes the 5th unit of the commodity, you see that marginal utility will be 0. By then, the total utility takes a maximum value of 50. That's what we can see the relation here. Total utility is maximum. That maximum value can be seen when the marginal utility is 0. The third relationship is the total utility is diminishing when marginal utility is negative. When the marginal utility gets into negative, total utility starts to fall. It tends to fall, for which we call it as total utility is diminishing when marginal utility is negative. Let us also understand some of the important properties of MU curve, that is marginal utility curve. The first property is marginal utility goes on diminishing throughout. When you observe the diagram, you notice that the marginal utility went on diminishing throughout, and based on the same property there is another property, that is marginal utility curve is downward sloping. Since the marginal utility consistently diminishes, it declines, it takes a downward slope. Marginal utility curve takes a downward slope. The law of diminishing marginal utility is not free from limitations. There are some limitations which restrict this law to function. Let's see what are those limitations. The first limitation is homogeneous goods. For the law of diminishing marginal utility to operate, the goods that we consider, that we consume, must be homogeneous. This we learned when we had taken assumption. The goods that is taken for the consumption should be homogeneous, they must be identical. If the goods are different, then the law may not operate. The second limitation is standard unit of consumption. When we take the commodities for consumption, we must see that it should be a reasonable standard. It should have a standard unit, or a reasonable unit must be considered. Let us take the same example that a person is thirsty and he drinks water to satisfy his thirsty. Here, a reasonable unit may be a glass of water. A glass of water is a reasonable unit. If you take a spoon of water, that cannot be considered as a reasonable unit. When you consume first spoon of water, you may not derive maximum satisfaction. Rather, the second spoon of water you may get little more, which is exactly opposite to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Therefore, for the law to operate, we must see that a reasonable units must be considered, a standard units of commodities must be taken into consideration. The third limitation is continuous consumption. There must not be any time gap between the consumption of one commodity and the other. The consumption of commodities of different units must be continuous, one after the other. If we consume a commodity today and another commodity tomorrow, the satisfaction level changes, the utility changes. Therefore, we should see that the consumption takes place continuously. Next comes fails in case of prestigious goods. Even the goods matters. We usually consider normal goods when we consider this law. If we consider prestigious goods like diamonds or money or any other costly goods, we see that as you accumulate, as you consume more and more units, you derive more satisfaction. In that case, utility utility will not diminish, rather it will increase. Therefore, for the law to operate, we must see that the commodity we take should be normal goods and not prestigious goods. When you get more and more money, our utility level increases, it will not diminish. Next is case of related goods. In the utility analysis, we come across demand, where there are two types of goods that we consider: substitute goods and complementary goods. Let us take one related good example of tea, which is an example of complementary goods. When we consume two goods together, we call it as complementary goods. In order to satisfy our wants, where the two goods are consumed together, like tea and sugar, you cannot have tea separately and sugar separately. When you take that related goods, it fails. In this case, we should see that the related goods should be taken in the same way. When you have the first cup of tea without sugar, it gives lesser utility. When you have the second cup of tea with sugar, it gives you more utility. In such cases of related goods, the law of diminishing marginal utility may not operate. So these are the limitations for the law to operate. Students, take up the assignment question from the topic that we have dealt today. The first assignment question that you need to take is: state the law of diminishing marginal utility, which you have to write in 4 sentences, which will be asked as 2 marks question. Another question, which is the most important question from your examination point of view, which will be asked for 6 marks, is: explain the law of diminishing marginal utility with the help of a table, that is nothing but schedule, what we have understood, and diagram. So based on the explanation given by me, make a notes of your own, write it in a book. Either you can submit it or you can also upload it to the link provided. Thank you.